at least version 1 of the audio book-based program, or the Alexa project. And the first tab page is the input page that I have Kurt Vonnegut on. I actually decided to put a number of author pictures in the blank areas because I needed such a huge area for listings that the others are kind of empty. This is the query edit page, and you notice it's almost identical to the input page in terms of the fields, but there's checkboxes by 3 of the fields: the type, the format, and the date, and there's 3 values for the radio buttons on read. And that's because this basically generates a query. And the criteria for adding fields to the query is whether they're blank or not. But some fields always have things filled in, like date always has a date filled in. So I put a checkbox and say, if the checkbox is there, date is actually significant. Otherwise, just ignore it. And the same with format and type. Format comes as a default being checked. And there's John D. McDonald, who writes the Travis McGee books. He's my picture for the query edit page. And the listings page has no picture because it's totally filled up with controls. In this case, I did a listing of Patricia Cornwell books. And the reason I did this is I just watched a Jeopardy, which said who wrote Cruel and Unusual and All That Remains. And I said Patricia Cornwell, and the other 3 guys in Jeopardy didn't get it, so I won the round. But here are the books: All That Remains and Cruel and Unusual. So it's verification. Actually, Alex Trebek verified it too. And then this is my add a type page, the codes page, and there's Patricia Cornwell herself in the lower right, and Michael Connolly, who writes the Harry Bosch books. Those are my 2 author pictures for this page, actually 3, with William Gibson, who coined the term cyberspace and really invented the concept of virtual reality that's taken over everything, including the Matrix movies these days. But what we really want to look at is the query edit page. And as I said, if these fields are filled in, they cause a query to be generated qualified by what's filled in the fields. And right now the only thing filled in is format, which is Borg. If I filled a bunch of fields in and I decided I don't want to use those values, I can clear everything by pressing the clear all button. But right now if we hit run query, we'll just get all the Borg format books, which there's quite a few. As you can see, it starts with the A's with Douglas Adams. And this is a list box format with a list format. We had details format previously, but this is list format. And as you can see, it goes from A to Z, alphabetically ordered by author, and then subordered by book within author. And this page itself is also usable, the query results form. You can select a number of these books, it's multiple select, and then hit edit or delete, and it will basically bring you into another level of form that'll deal with the detail records. Usually we qualify them more in terms of the query generator though. So we're going to say all the authors that start with an M and all the titles that start with a D, and then run the query, and you see we get quite a fewer results. There's all the John D. McDonald D books, Darker Than Amber, Deadly Shade of Gold, Deep Blue Goodbye, and so on. And then Thomas More's Dark Night of the Soul, Devil in a Blue Dress, which is written by Walter Mosley, and so on. All the M's and D's. So if we want to actually edit these books, change fields within them, say change it from unread to read, which is my most common change, or change the title or the author or whatever, I can select them by clicking or holding down Control and click to select multiple values, Or you can select one, go to a last one, and hit shift click, which will select the whole range. And then if you click edit, it brings up this third level of form, the edit record level. And you'll notice this also is a lot like an input record, but it has a checkbox by every single field. And basically that's because if you want to change a value within a field, you have to click one of these checkboxes. And then it will do an update on the record. And when you hit save, it'll save that updated field value. But as you see, if you don't select anything, it says no field change checkbox selected. Press cancel instead. So if you just want to look at it, don't select any checkboxes and hit cancel, and you'll look at the detail records for every record you've selected. And here's the Arthur Miller Death of a Salesman, which is a play rather than a book. Willy Loman Rules. So we hit cancel and we go to the third book we selected, which was Thomas More's Dark Night of the Soul. Not the royalty Thomas More. The only self-help he did is he helped himself in the Tower of London. No, he accomplished a lot more. I don't know what, but he did. So if we hit cancel, we'll get out of this detailed record, and we'll be back in the query results page, which is still usable if we want to select another book or a group of books. So I select a book and hit edit, and now we have another record. We edit record, in this case Ed McBain's Downtown, and we can edit this, select the checkbox to edit a field, and select save to update the record, or just select cancel if we just want to look at it, and select cancel to change the query edit page. Or we can use the frequent authors to fill in just one specific author. Save a lot of typing. Like in this case, Jane Austen. And hit run query. And here's the vast number of Jane Austen books I have. Northanger Abbey and Pride and Prejudice. And you can select a book and press delete to delete it too, which we definitely don't want to do. Or you can press cancel to change the query results page. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and may we examine the concept of translating Windows form fields or C# form fields into SQL in order to create a query. And you'll notice that these forms are almost identical to the input form controls. And the reason that is I just copied them initially. I dragged a tracking rectangle by holding down the left mouse button. Let it go, all the controls were selected. Then I right-clicked on any one of the controls and selected copy. And then I went to the query edit page, which at that point in time was totally empty. And I right-clicked again and selected paste. And to an amazing extent that worked, although I have to rename a lot of the controls for purposes of the program. And I had to add several controls, like the 3 checkboxes by type, format, and date, and a third radio button called both, because the basic philosophy behind creating a query from a form. I also added a clear button to clear the author text field, and then a clear all button to clear all the forms, put everything back into its original state. But I almost never call the press the clear all button directly, because I automatically call the same subroutine when I've finished with a query. And the type and format are bound controls. And when I copied them, I was actually kind of surprised to find out that I totally copied the data source, which is AB type binding source, and the display member, which is type, which is the symbolic type name, and the value member, which is the type code, which automatically does relational database lookup for us via the control. In effect, you don't have to join to the table because the control does the lookup for you. And the format was the same way when I did it, was all already there. The weird side effect of that is when you change this control on the query page, it also changes on the input page. You probably never noticed that, but that happens. Within the code itself, the first thing I do is I copy the text fields over to local text variables or string variables. For instance, txtqauthor.text I copy over to strauthor, and so on. And the ultimate goal of this is I want to create a SQL string variable, which is the big SQL query. I call it MSQL, and that's created within the button run query click event. So almost everything's within this click event. And a subquery of this is str where clause, which is the where clause of the select query. And this may or may not exist depending on whether there's anything filled in the form. And the way I know whether or not it exists is I have a local variable called nWhereCount, which says how many subclauses within the where clause there is. If there's 0, there is no where clause. Then I fill in the str local variables from the text fields, which is a pretty straightforward assignment. And for the bound data controls, I use the selected value .toString, which gives us that number value, which is the relational database lookup I was talking about before. And for the date, I do something a little different. I use a datetime object, and I use it to convert to datetime from the text field. And then I use the toString function of datetime to convert it to month, day, year format in terms of the string, which is USA type date format. And I actually discovered a bug when I was going over this lesson, which I'm using the tsql convert command to convert the date saved in the database to a string to compare to the string we get. But I used European format rather than American format. So the first part of the MSQL concatenation is I create the select statement, and I select a book ID, author, and title from audiobooks. Audiobooks is the main table of the audio database. And then for the str where clause, which is a different string, I start that off with space where space, which is the beginning of the clause. And then I set the n where count equal to 0. And if that stays 0, there is no where clause. But if it gets incremented, it means that we've added where clauses via these subsections I call control to SQL translation sections. And the first such section is the author. And basically I simply have an if statement that says if the str author local variable is empty, which means the text field was empty, then do nothing. So if I said not empty, then fall into translation section. And if the n where count is not equal to 0, which means we've had where clauses before. Then concatenate the space and space to say have an and clause within the where clause, because we're having multiple conditions. And then I have the subclause itself is author like, and then a single quote, and then the str author field, and then a percent sign. A percent sign is a wildcard. It's saying whatever's in the str author field and any other characters that after that. So if I just have an A in that field, I'll select all the authors that begin with A, which is kind of nice. I quite often want to do something like that. And then finally I increment the in where clause to let the system know that thou is a where clause. And there's two things that that's valuable for. One thing is adding the and to the where clause, so that I'm saying this and this and this. And the second thing is letting the system know that there's any where clauses at all. So I include the where clause in concatenating the string. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and it continues on in the next lesson. So remember to focus and learn a lot. In the previous lesson we covered the str author form to SQL string translation section. Now we're going to move on to the second form to SQL translation section, the str title, which is gotten from the title text field. And once again we check to see if it's empty. And if it is empty, we don't do anything. If it isn't empty, we check the in where count clause to see if there's been previous sub clauses added. And if there has, we concatenate in the space and space substring, because there's multiple subclauses within the where. And then once again, just like previously, we have a title like single quote, and then the str title field, and then a percent sign, which is a wild card that says whatever letters are in the title and any letters after that will match. So you can just have T, and all the titles that start with T will be matched. Now we move into something new, and that we're checking the checkbox next to the format. And if that's checked, it means the format counts. And the reason we need a checkbox next to the format and the type and the date is there's always something in there. We can't just check if they're blank, because they're always filled in. In the case of format, it's a bound data control, so there's always going to be a value in there. And if it is checked, there's the selected value from the bound control, which indicates that there's always a selected value because it's a bound control with something always in it. Like in the case of format, Borg is always going to be in it because it's the first thing in terms of the alphabetical sort. So that actually defaults to being checked, because I by default want to just look at Borgs generally. But you can uncheck it if you want to look at other audio types, like pre-recorded tapes and things like that. Since I want to be totally robust in my query edit, be able to edit anything. Then once again, it's pretty much the same sort of thing. I have a parentheses and the clause. In this case, format type is a field name, and equal to, and then whatever was in the selected value. And you notice there's no single quotes because it's not a string. And then we increment the where count to indicate that we have a clause in here. And the handling of the specific type checkbox is pretty much the same. We're looking at the book type field instead of the format type field within the audio books record. But in terms of the creating the substring, pretty much identical. And once again, we always increment the where count to indicate that we have another count. In terms of the STR box, that's like Z8A. They're containers, usually cylinders of CDRs, where I have the backup of the movies saved. And I checked the where count to see if I should put an AND in there once again. And then I have the box variable compared to the string of Z8A or whatever's in the text box. But now I add yet another subsection, which is the date part. This is the only part the date is looked at because the date is used as part of the location. I have a cylinder like Z8A, and then each of the CDRs within the cylinder have a date, so they're ordered within the cylinder. So I can then look at the, if this is checked, I'm saying I want to look actually at a specific CDR, not just a specific container. And this is where the bug showed up, actually. And that you'll notice I have a string that does convert of dirk date, which is the field within the audio books table. The field name is dirk date because I used to call them dirks instead of borgs. Dirk was an earlier format type. And I'm using a 103 code value as the style the date's in for the convert. So this is actually going to convert it to European format, which is day, day, month, month, year, year. So this comparison is never going to work. And I was looking at it as I was creating this lesson. And I said, wait a minute, I think that's wrong. So I actually fixed this bug in the course of making this lesson. As you can see, I'm about to change it to a 101 instead of a 103 for that date comparison. And now I'm going to save this and compile it. And see, I'm looking up here and I'm using, when I convert the control, I convert it to USA format. But when I was converting the field from the record, I was converting it to European format, which would never match. Well, it might match by pure luck. No, it'll never match. And what I need to do now is save the change from 103 to 101 in terms of the tsql convert command, and compile this and then actually run some test data. So I looked up a specific CDR which had the date of March 29th, 2008 in the box Z8A, and it was I believe Alien Voices was the name of it. So I put that data into the query, and I don't have anything else checked except for the Borg format, and I run it, and I should get like 3 to 4 books because that's how many I usually fit on a CD, including the Alien Voices I was looking for. And indeed that is the data I get. So this modification does send to test out, and John D. McDonald is looking on with pride in my work here. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and remember to focus and learn a lot. The next section we look at the number of items, which is like the number of original cassettes or the number of CDs. And it's pretty much the same way. If there's nothing in that field, do nothing. If there is something in that field, check to see whether we've had previous clauses, and if we have, add the space and space for multiple clauses within the where. and then we check the number of tapes field within the audio books table and compare it to the value in the control, and keep everything within parentheses as usual in order to keep things nicely separated. And we increment the where count to indicate that we've added another possible value. For the radio buttons, it's a little different again. We check whether the read is checked, or the two lines mean or. The unread is checked. And this condition may be true or it may not be true. There's a third radio button now called both that could be checked, so that this if clause could not be true if the both is checked. And we then check if the read is checked. And if the read is checked, we do done equal to 1, which means we have read it. And if the read isn't checked, it means the unread has to be checked because of this outer if statement. So we can then, with assurance, instead make the comparison done not equal to 1. Less than greater than is not equal in terms of TSQL. And once again, we increment the where count to indicate there are where clauses. And now we've finished all the subsections. So we need to go into an if that says, are there any where clauses? There may not be any where clauses. Nothing may be selected, in which case we want to look at everything. So if there are any where clauses, concatenate the str where clause to our main m_s SQL string, which is the big SQL string we're creating with this program. And if another clause we always put in is the order by clause, order by author, and then title within author. So we'll get a nice sorted result. And then what we want to do with this, then we want to clear the form. As I mentioned before, we call the clear all click event, which sets all the values in the form back to a nice original state. But next we want to do something kind of clever, something we looked at the beginning of the Alexa series, which is we create a new form called the query results form, and it has an instantiated name of QR, and we pass to the constructor of that form our m_s SQL query that we've created laboriously through all these subsections. And then we do a QR.show, which shows this form. So we need to look at what this form is actually like. And it's pretty much just one huge list view to contain all the names of the books that were a result of this query. And we want to be able to either edit these books or delete them, depending on whether they're selected within the list view, or do a cancel if we just want to look at them. And if you look at the properties of the list view, we'll select the list view here. You'll notice, for one thing, the view is list, which means we're just going to see the titles with no column headers or anything like that. And the multiple select is set to true, which means we can hold down the control and click on multiple values. So we can edit, say, as many records as we want. If we had 100 records in here, we could potentially edit 100 records. And within the form code, the query result form code, we have another m_s SQL, which is an entirely different variable than the one we've been looking at. And you'll notice the constructor for the form. We have a parameter which is p underscore SQL. And all the constructor really does is set our local m underscore SQL to this parameter underscore SQL. So we've passed the string we created in the previous form to this new form. And what's great about this is we can take all this work we did previously, and in effect the string saves all that work, and then we pass it to the new form, whose job is to display the results of that work, the results of when the query was executed. And the list view shows all the books that we wanted to look at, and we can select all the books we want to either edit or delete. Usually edit. I very rarely delete books. And it nicely parcels out the work into different levels of forms. And as you'll see in the future lessons, we actually go into yet another level of form, which is multiple forms of records that need to be edited based on what's selected within the list view. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and remember to focus and learn a lot. I'll see you next lesson. The design of the Query Edit tab page consists essentially of 3 levels of forms. On the first level, shown in red here, we have the input form, which has the various fields of author and title and box and number of tapes and so on, that generates a customized SQL query. And this SQL statement, which essentially is a string, is then passed to the second level of form, which is the query results form, and specifically to the list view within the query results form, which displays authors and titles just as very basic data, in multiple columns if there's a lot of them. And this is not only displayed, but it's selectable. You can select any number of the items in the list view. And if you press the edit button after you select these items, it generates a number of other forms called edit record forms, shown here in the purple. And what gets passed from the query results form to the edit record form is a record number. And these are actually passed in a loop. And the way it's written, only one of the edit record forms is displayed at a time. You may have 10 if you selected 10 items, but these are presented one at a time, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on through 10. It's the difference between modal and modeless presentation. And a modeless presentation, all 10 of the forms will be put on the screen at once, probably in a cascading manner, one up of the other, and you could switch back and forth between them at will. But I think in terms of the application, it's much better to do just one at a time. Focus on one thing at a time. The way we actually implement this design in terms of the code within the second level query results form is that we assign a local variable MSSQL to the parameter we get in the constructor, which is directly passed to us from the tab page form. So this is the data communication we're talking about in the data flow diagram. And then we go through the usual process of setting up a connection to the database based on this SQL string that's been passed to us. We start out by establishing the SQL connection with the new SQL connection command. And we assign the SQL connection string property to our standard SQL connection string that we've established all along. ID of Alexa and password of Diana. Then we open the connection with the open method, and then we instantiate a SQL command object with new SQL command and set the connection property of the command object to our established connection object, hooking all the objects together in the proper manner. And then we set our command text to the SQL string that we got passed from the previous level form, query edit form. And then we create a SQL data reader object with the execute reader method of the command object. And this populates the audio book object with a number of records. And then we iterate through these records using the read method of the SQL data reader. And the first thing we do is create a string, a local string, that consists of the author field concatenated with the title field with a dash in between. And then we instantiate a new list view item. And we set the text property of this list view item to the string we've created, the author title string. And then most significantly for the next step, which is generating the edit record forms, we set the tag of the list view item to the field A book ID, which is a primary key that uniquely identifies each of these records that we're iterating through. Then we display the string we've created in our list view via the items.add method. And finally we close the audio book SQL data reader. Well, in the next lesson we'll look at how we spawn the edit record forms from the list view items that we put on the second level form, the query results form. So we're getting to the end of the road. It's a long road, probably the most complex design so far I've presented. I'll see you then, and until then, remember to focus and learn a lot. In the previous lesson we saw how the value went, or how we went from the first level form to the second level form, the query edit form. And look at the query edit form. It consists really of two things: a big list view and 3 buttons. And the list view name is LSV query results, which it becomes key in generating the third level, the edit record level. And the way we get to this level is by clicking on the edit button. And amazingly, this is all the code we need for it to create all the edit records from the second level to the third level. And essentially it's going through and looking at all the selected list view items. It uses a local variable called nRecKey, and it uses the count of the items, the selected items, which is a collection. And it does a loop that starts at 0 and goes to 1 less than this count. And then it selects each of the items in this collection in turn, indexed by the I. That's the loop index. And specifically it looks at the tag field of this selected item. And you remember in the tag field we put the A book ID, which is the primary key of the audio books record. And once we have that value, we spawn a new, or we instantiate a new form of the edit record type, and we pass this record number to its constructor, the nRecKey that we just read in from the tag of the listed item. And then we display the form, but rather than use show, we use show dialog. This is the first time we've seen show dialog. And the difference between show and show dialog is show dialog is modal, M-O-D-A-L, which means you have to close the window before you can do anything else. The window sort of takes over when it's modal. So this is the record itself, the edit record form, the way it looks. And as you can see, it's almost identical to an input form with some key differences. And one of the key differences is there's now a checkbox next to every single field. And the reason for all these checkboxes is we want to say if anything's checked, change that value in the record. And then we have text boxes for every single field also, even fields that have like a bound data control or a date picker. And these text boxes show what the current values of the record are, which is nice if we're just looking at the record, if we're not actually interested in changing it but looking at it. Once again, the constructor of the edit form receives a parameter, which is underscore n record key, which passed to us from the previous level, as you recall from the previous discussion. And once again, this parameter gets set to a form scope variable, m underscore n rec key. M underscore is a general convention for a member that's like a form scope or class scope. And underscore is another convention for parameters. So in the load event of this form, we're going to fill in all these text boxes that have the values of all the fields we're interested in. And that basically involves creating a big STR_SQL string that we're going to pass to a command object. So this string is a select, and it says a select of all the fields within the audio book main and also two fields in relational database connected records that we connect with it with two joins, the AB type table and the AB format table. And we use values from these tables to fill in the type and format value, which are a nice text string like science fiction and Borg, so things a human can understand, as opposed to 1 and 2, 3 and 4 code values. And we use the where AD book ID equals to the value that's been passed to this form from the previous level of form. So we should get exactly one record out of this, because the A book ID is a primary key and unique. Then we establish our SQL connection object, set its connection string to our long overused connection string we've used about 25 times now, and then do an open on the connection object. And then we create a SQL command object, instantiate it with the new operator, and set its connection field to the connection object we just created. And then we set the command text to the SQL string we've just created, which does a join on the three tables. And then we create a SQL data reader object using the execute reader method of the command object. And as I said, this should create exactly one record, because it's have as a where clause on the primary key. So we do a audiobook.read to read in that one record. And then we set the all the text fields we're looking at previously in the form based on these field values we've just read in. Set author to author, title to title, and so on. We can directly set the date field to date because we've done a convert within the SQL of a 101 style format. So it's now a nice readable string. The one special handling we do have to do is we need to set a local variable to the done field, which is 0 or 1. And say if the done field's equal to 1, set the text field to read. And if the done field's anything else, it should just be 0. Set it to unread. And then we close our SQL data reader object. Well, in the next lesson we're going to talk about how we actually save changed values from these fields that we've read in using our SQL select statement. And we'll do this with the save button based on what checkboxes have been checked. If checked, it means we want to change that value. So these checkboxes are used. Until that lesson, remember to focus and learn a lot. Discussion of the previous lesson. We've gotten to the point where we've spawned a third level of form, the edit record form, and we've filled in all the text fields of this form based on what the record we've read in with a command object that uses a unique key, the primary key, so we get one record. And then we select text boxes, or the user selects text boxes and presses the save button in order to change these fields. So let's look at the button save click event now and see how we actually save change values to these fields. And once again it's an SQL command, but this time it's an update SQL command. It says update audio books, which is our main table, and then it has a set command, and then there'll be a series of, or particularly be a series of clauses that say, for instance, author equals and then a delimited new author value, and title equals a delimited new title value. And rather than having a straight assignment, you'll notice, or a straight concatenation, you notice we're concatenating a substring that starts at 0 and goes to the length of the clause -2. And then we concatenate another new line value, the /n, on the end of this string. And the reason we're doing this has to do with the way we create these clauses. Once again, we have a number of if statements which look at the checkboxes to see if we should be creating an update clause. And if it's checked, we should be. So we take our str set clause and concatenate, and for instance, author equals, and then a single quote to delimit it, and the text field value to string and trimmed. But then after we concatenate in this value, we concatenate in a closing single quote and also a comma and a new line. And it's this comma and new line that are the two characters we need to get rid of, because we want a comma and new line after every clause that isn't an ending clause. But when it is an ending clause, we don't want a comma. The last clause doesn't have a comma. So we have to do a substring that gets rid of the comma and the new line and then puts the new line back, because we do want a new line, but we don't want the comma. It would be incorrect format to have a comma after the last clause. So that's basically the rationale for using the dot substring in the concatenated clause. Another special handling we have is if the date is checked. We want to read in the date value to a date time object and then convert it into standard USA format, and then concatenate dirt date equals to this string, and once again put in the comma and the new line. And always within these clauses we increment a variable called end checkbox checked, so that we check if we have anything checked at the end. And you know, this is the whole rationale for the substring I've been discussing previously. and we use a where clause to say update only one record, the record with the ID that we've been passed from the previous form level. So after we've created that update string, we create a command object, set the connection value to our connection object, and then set the command text to the command string we've just created, and execute it with execute non-query, because we're not looking to return any data. We're just writing data. But what happens if the user doesn't check any checkboxes and we do a close on the object, a close on the form? Have to do that because it's modal. But if the user doesn't check any checkboxes, the end check count is going to be 0. But if we're in the save, it means he didn't check any checkboxes and click save, so he's obviously confused. So we just pop up a message box that says no field chain checkboxes selected. Please, well, I don't say please, I should say please. Press cancel instead. It's polite. I like software that's polite, but this is so that more or less completes how the edit record is handled in terms of the save. But I don't think this will mean much unless you actually see an example. So the next lesson we're going to look at an example of this code actually running. Until then, remember to focus and learn a lot. In order to test this data, we have kind of a delicate problem in that it's real data and I don't want to mess it up. I want to be able to find things. So the best solution is to go back to old formats that I haven't used in about 10 years, like tape wave. And what tape wave is actual physical cassettes that I saved in two types of storage places. One is just like packing crates, you know, like you ship things in. And the other was wine crates, which was much nicer. So these wooden boxes that had rows and columns. And I could actually specify the location of the beginning of the tapes by the column number and the row number within the wine crate. And if I select a selection here, you'll see both types. And the way you can tell the wine crate is the X and Y values have values in them. The X indicates what column the tape starts in, and the Y indicates what row. So I can go to an exact cassette. As you can see, these are just packing crates. Here's a wine crate, the box CE, column 3 and row 20. And here's another wine crate, column 3 and row 13. This is a regular box, which I suppose I could use X, Y, and Z, but that's a little compulsive even for me. So I want to select something I know is a box rather than wine crate. And I'll edit that to put in X and Y values. And then we can bring it up again to see if they're actually saved in the database and changed. So I put in an X value of 3 and a Y value of 15. And of course I have to click the check boxes to say I want to change that data. And I click save. And if the code worked, these values should be 3 and 15 when I bring up the data again. So if I click edit again and check these values, sure enough, the 3 and the 15 got saved. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and remember to focus and learn a lot. I'll see you next lesson.